Thank you so much, Yaniv. Thank you, Dr. Yaniv Harel from EMC and from our very own ICRC Belvatnik Center. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite one of my personal friends, a gentleman who traveled all the way from Washington, D.C. to be with you here today and to present his visions. This is Mr. Beau Woods. Beau is a deputy director of the Statecraft initiative with the Atlantic Council, a leading think tank in Washington, D.C. But Beau is not just a think tank, Washington suit and tie. In fact, I met him at a hacker conference. This is because Beau's work prior to joining the Atlantic Council was with a grassroots hacker movement called I Am the Cavalry, a movement that has been focusing security research on things that matter for human life and public safety. And this is, if there's only one takeaway you can take from our entire Cyber Week, this is it. Cybersecurity is not about secrets and information. It is about defending our modern, new, connected way of life. Please help me by welcoming Beau Woods to the stage. Give him a warm round of applause to show him our Tel Aviv hospitality. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. So I took the idea of building resilient ecosystems and I wanted to play on it a little bit because the ecosystems, at least the technical ecosystems, are only a part of what we're trying to do. They serve a bigger, broader purpose, which is to build more resilient societies. Over the past 10 to 20 years, we've been doing that through cyber-connected technologies as kind of an underpinning. So over the last 50 years in the US alone, automotive safety engineering has saved over 610,000 lives on US roads. We still have about 34,000 lives lost every year on US roads. Something like 94% of those are caused by human error. There's some type of a mistake, a poor judgment made, distracted driving, turning into the wrong lane at the wrong time. The promise of vehicle-to-vehicle, vehicle-to-infrastructure, and autonomous cars, all underpinned by cyber technologies, can reduce those numbers greatly to where, could you imagine if we had, maybe a triple-digit or a quadruple-digit number of deaths? That would be kind of an amazing thing, coming from 34,000 per year. Now, similarly, in hospitals in the US, we have about 98,000 deaths caused by hospital errors. These are patients who come in for one reason and end up not going home for a different reason. In the late 90s and early 2000s, we decided to take that problem on, and we invented the concept of electronic healthcare records to be able to better keep tabs on what doctors are prescribing, how they're being treated, and to get a much higher level of quality into the healthcare delivery system. More and more, the treatment is actually being carried out by connected medical devices, which promise to have the same types of exponential benefits as connected technologies in other places, namely the ability to scale and automate with fewer mistakes and errors. But with great promise can come great peril. The same capabilities that can save and preserve life can also harm and end life. I've got a friend, Jay Radcliffe, who's he's a diabetic, and he had an insulin pump until, because he's a hacker, he found out that it was vulnerable to several different types of attacks. He now no longer trusts that technology and he injects himself with insulin 10 to 20 times every single day. He's denied himself the best medical treatment available commercially because he doesn't trust the underlying technology. Similarly, in talking with people in the congressional staffers, talking about car hacking, they said, look, we don't so much care about loss of life because, again, 34,000 people die on our roads every year. What's more concerning to us is that any crisis of confidence in the buying public would affect a double-digit portion of the American GDP. Now, that's pretty stunning if you think about what that trust relationship means. And as companies are now investing billions and billions of dollars in smart homes technology and other Internet of Things areas, what does it mean if consumers are unwilling to buy those technologies? Earlier this year, the Atlantic Council released a paper where we counted about 66% of potential customers for Internet of Things smart homes devices had very serious concerns about the security of those devices. People with very serious concerns don't buy them. So what does it mean if an expected $1.7 trillion in global benefit by 2020 is erased because of a lack of trust? And there's also a lack of public trust in governments. Governments are supposed to keep us safe from bad actors. They're supposed to protect us from things that harm us in a systemic way. If they're failing on that promise, then people will drop out of the social contract. You'll see more broader social protest movements like Occupy, like Anonymous, could even lead to non-state actor groups, and some type of a broader activism and more violent reactions. So a few years ago, as Karen mentioned, some friends of mine started an organization called I Am the Cavalry. The premise was that our dependence on connected technology was growing faster than our ability to. When it comes to things like medical devices, cars, airplanes, trains, the failure rates that we have in corporate IT are no longer good enough. So the theory was if we got high enough in the government, surely someone would be looking out for this, someone would have a clue, and they would have been working on solutions a long time ago. What we found when we got there is that actually that wasn't the case, that we were the adults in the room, that simultaneously scared the hell out of us and empowered us. So we said, if the cavalry isn't coming to save us at the last minute like John Wayne in the movies, then that responsibility falls to us. I Am the Cavalry is a personal declaration that I will be part of the solution. The second force that we have driving some of this failure modes or potential failure modes is vulnerability. All systems fail. Engineers know that. All software has flaws because people make mistakes. Software is coded by people for today, and we're liable to make mistakes. So it's not that vulnerability exists. Of course it exists. It's how do we track it, measure it, resist it, and overcome it. And in software engineering, we have a concept of defect density. There's a certain number of defects per 1,000 lines of code is the scale that it's measured in. And people disagree over what that number actually is, but on a scale of 100 million lines of code like you have in many modern automobiles, that still represents tens of thousands of systemic vulnerabilities that exist. We also have another force that's emerging in vulnerability, which is the tendency to assemble systems from code components rather than to write everything from scratch, which is a good thing. It leads to more resilient code because you find the flaws in it earlier. However, it also means that we're inheriting vulnerabilities from these lower level code components into the higher level systems. So you can have issues where these parts are assembled, the final goods assembler, the automaker maybe, doesn't know all the vulnerabilities or even all the software packages that might be in their final system. One of the third components of this is we have an increasing amount of connectivity, right? Software in isolation can only do so much. When you connect to other software, it can do much, much more. It's much more powerful. However, that comes at a cost of exposure to accidents and adversaries. In talking with some of the people from the automotive industry, they've compared this to whether or not your car is engineered to drive in an underwater environment. And of course, almost no cars today are made to do that, except for some that you've seen in YouTube clips. However, cars were also not engineered, the software stack, to survive in an internet environment. And yet we're rapidly connecting those with 4G LTE. We're adopting app stores. Just the other day, I saw that a lot of Lexuses had their entertainment system shut down because there was some bad data coming from one of the third-party app suppliers that caused a crash of the infotainment system, which actually took out the air conditioning. And being here in Tel Aviv the last few days, I think if cars didn't have air conditioning, it would be a pretty severe problem, right? At least for our comfort. So these are the types of things that you can have happen when you have this increasing dependency, which we know that we have. We have increasing vulnerability measured in total lines of software code at a certain defect density. And you have an increasing exposure. So typically at this point, somebody jumps up and says, all right, well, but we've got this security model that we already know how to work. We can do this, right? And yet, we know that approximately 100% of the Fortune 100 have lost intellectual property over the past few years. This is something that Richard Clark said in 2012, and it's still true today. We also have approximately 4% acceptable fraud rate in financial transactions. That's just the cost of doing business. As we go to depend more and more on these same types of infrastructures that we have in the corporate environments, it's worth asking the question whether these are acceptable failure rates in death toll, in public safety problems, in public health issues, if patients are afraid to go to the hospitals because they think they might be hacked in the hospital. And I don't think that we've had those societal level discussions. So in the face of these uncomfortable truths, we need to look for unconventional approaches to solve those. So a couple of years ago, I and the Cavalry published a 5-star automotive cyber safety framework. Earlier this year, we followed that up with a Hippocratic Oath for connected medical devices. The idea was not to have a prescriptive regime for technology controls. It was to look at what capabilities, both technical and non-technical, are available that we know can help. So if you start from the premise that all systems fail, what are your postures towards failure? And there's 5 common things that we found in a parallel evolution of these 2 lists that seem to fit on these 2 places and probably others in the Internet of Things at least. So if all systems fail, then how do you anticipate and avoid failure? Number 1. Secondly, how do you take help avoiding failure? Third, how do you learn from failure once you know it's happened? Fourth, how do you then inoculate against future failures in the deployed fleet? And fifth, how do you isolate and contain failures? So that's the simple way to say it. There's more complex ways, more detail under that. Essentially, it breaks out to security or cyber safety by design. That is, how do you look at the product development lifecycle and infuse it with a good degree of cluefulness from the practices that we know work very well. Things like adversarial resilience testing, things like a formal software security development lifecycle. Secondly, taking help from willing allies or third-party researchers. Karen talked a little bit about this. When GM launched its bug bounty program, within 72 hours, they had triple-digit submissions of bugs. Double-digit of those were unique and severe. Within that same 72-hour framework, they actually managed to fix 3 of them. That's how quickly organizations can move when they know about these flaws. Now, if you think about it, 100 submissions in 72 hours, that's too fast to be somebody going out and buying a car and then starting to hack on it. These were bugs that were already known, that the researchers were afraid to tell the organizations for fear of lawsuit. When GM said, we're not going to sue you, those researchers opened up and helped protect the public in a way that also protected themselves. The fourth one, inoculating against failure, has to do with software updates. If you look at a lot of the update processes that happen now in Internet of Things and some of these other technologies, you actually have to go and replace hardware. So if you think about the difference between a software update, whether it's over the air, like we have on our phones, or whether it's through some type of a manual process, a software update requires that you learn about a flaw, you fix it in software, and you develop an update for it. To do a hardware update, you actually have to manufacture new systems, go in and do a physical replacement. You're talking orders of magnitude more time to be able to do these things. And in looking at the medical device industry, if you think about what it might take on a timeline of a medical device to replace some of these systems, if you don't have the ability to patch them, it can be years, not weeks. That's a long time to be out there exposed. And then finally, compartmentalization and isolation, segmentation. If you think about a submarine, when one of its areas is punctured, the sub doesn't sink because they have ways to segment that off. And so it's the same in software. When your infotainment system goes down because of bad data or because of a malicious attack, it should not also have the capability to take out your brakes. So severing those links that exist today might be a good way to protect against this. A second unconventional approach is something that was proposed by, in 2014 by Congressman Royce. And it was a Cyber Supply Chain Management and Transparency Act. Briefly, essentially what it did is it said, we need to know all the third-party code components, things like a bill of materials for software or a food label or nutritional information to know what the ingredients list is. No known flaws in the software, or if you do have flaws, it should have a good reason for it. And then third, it should be software updatable. Once we know about the flaws, we can fix them. This didn't pass, but organizations like the Mayo Clinic and the Underwriters Laboratory have begun to adopt these things voluntarily. Second idea is, or the next idea is to be able to bring some type of a regime to hold final goods manufacturers in good faith accountable for some of these things. So there's a famous case of McPherson versus Buick Motor Company back in 1916, where Buick was assembling the car. A guy named McPherson had a defective wheel. The courts found that Buick Motor Company was liable for his injury because they were in the best position to be able to eliminate defects throughout the supply chain. If we're not looking at these things now, we must start soon. The reason being, this is the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. In the 1960s, it caught fire because of all the pollution, and it stayed on fire. It hit the news cycle, and it triggered an inevitable reaction from policymakers who overnight put in place a sweeping environmental regime. Now, that's a very good thing in the long term. In the short term, it had some severe limitations. It hurt businesses in the way that they were able to operate, and it actually was a little bit counterproductive. If we don't have good, clueful response mechanisms in the face of a disaster like this, ready to go, we won't be able to survive. We'll have more harm done than good. As some people have told me, some of the things that might happen would be extinction-level events for the software industry. So we need to start thinking, planning, and acting now before it's too late. Thank you very much.